So I'm talking about device embolization and how to make a fishing expedition successful. So these are my disclosures. And I guess I should also disclose that I guess I'm considered an expert in embolizing devices, which is why I'm here today, and thankfully being able to successfully retrieve them too. So vigorous tug testing or wiggle testing, and also cases where you have aggressive device oversizing. And in cases where the implantation is somewhat suboptimal, compounding the problem with conversion to sinus rhythm and aggressive physical movements can also aggravate the situation and liberate the device. So if you look in the literature, the incidence of device embolization with Watchman ranges between 0% to 1.3%. On average, is 0.6% with Watchman. And if you look at the ACP device overall, it's somewhere in the range of 1 to 2%. If you can look at the recent data by Zikis, it's about 1% out of the 1,000 patient series. And Adelminian just published this very recently online at Catheterization Cardiovascular Intervention. They did a systematic analysis of published literature, published cases of embolized Watchman and ACP device. So in total, there's 31 cases, 12 with Watchman and 19 with ACP. And this study is quite illuminating. It tells us a few things. Number one, the timing of device embolization, 2/3 occurred acutely and about 1/3 occurred late. And of those acute cases, 60% occurred during the procedure itself. And for 35% of these cases, it occurred on imaging, post-procedure, the same day or the day after. One case occurred 3 days after implantation. In terms of late embolizations, they pretty much all occurred during routine imaging between 1 to 7 months on TTE or TEE, except for one patient who presented with cardiogenic shock. So out of these 31 cases, only 2 were symptomatic. One patient had palpitation the day after, and one patient presented with a cardiogenic shock about a month after. And if you look at the location of the embolized devices, the majority actually were located in the aorta or the left ventricle, about half and half, and a small number in the left atrium. And if you look at the need for surgical explantation, this occurred in all cases essentially in devices found in the left ventricle. The one patient actually died before going for surgical retrieval. For the other locations in the aorta and the left atrium, 17% required surgical removal. So just having shown you those figures for now, so if you can just answer this question. So if you ever had an embolized device, what would you do? Would you try and snare just for an hour and then giving up? Would you try snaring for multiple hours before giving up? Or you would not even try snaring at all, you just refer to the surgeon? Or would you snare for devices in the aorta and left atrium, but not in the left ventricle? Or would you call your interventional colleague to snare it for you? So how much time do we have here? 9 seconds remaining. Oh, there it is. Okay, so 6 seconds remaining. Okay, let's see the results. That's quite a good mix, but I'm glad the majority actually, well, relative majority said they would attempt to snare the device, so that's great. And so if you were to, try and snare the device, what is your preferred choice? What's your snaring tool? Gooseneck snare, a multi-loop snare, biopsy tool, or you call the surgeon. Another 10 seconds. I hope we have a unanimous choice here. Let's see the answer. Oh, well, not quite unanimous, but a snare of some sort. All right, so let's look at the retrieval difficulties. Obviously, it depends on the location of the device, so the hardest being in the left ventricle and the easiest being in the aorta. But I will submit to you that your experience, your equipment and technique also makes a difference in terms of success in retrieving these devices. So here are the tools that you require to percutaneously retrieve these devices. The ones in bold are absolutely necessary. You should have them in your laboratory. So a large sheath, 80 to 100 centimeters, at least a 14 French, preferably larger ones if you have available. Gooseneck snares can be really any sizes, anywhere between 10 to 25 millimeters. And sometimes, people have tried using end snare. I haven't had success with that. Bioptome, you should certainly have that. And you want to consider, maybe creating a bevel tip on the sheath if your sheath size is not large enough to pull it in, and having a transvenous pacer as a backup. So let's just delve right into fishing 101. So what is the technique to retrieve these devices? I'll start with the ACP. And my approach here is to put a gooseneck snare inside a 5 or 6 French guide, because the guide allows you to angle and manipulate and seek out your device. And you want to place that telescoping into your large sheath. Either, as I said, 14 to 16 is adequate for an ACP. So here what we're trying to snare is actually one of the screws, one of the end screws. In this example here, I'm snaring the distal end screw. And you can see it's relatively straightforward to pull this device in through that approach through a 14 French sheath. And this video was taken on Sunday with my iPhone. And I'm selling to the device companies. You can also try and snare the proximal end screw as well, although that's not my preferred technique, because if you consider where the hooks are, when you're trying to pull it back from the proximal end screw, you do encounter the hooks being a bit of an impediment. So it's a little bit tougher, so you have to pull a little bit stronger. But it is feasible. But just, again, keep in mind that the Amulet device would not have the proximal end screw anyway, so you are left with the distal end screw to snare. So you can see that once you get into the lobe part, there is that little snag, and this is where the hooks are. So it's a little bit more challenging, but doable. So let me show you a couple of live cases. So this is an example where an areocranial, this looks like a windsock appearance, but it's actually a bilobe appendage. I'll just go through these initial pictures very quickly because I want to go to the snaring part. So essentially, we've positioned this, got the lobe in place, check position, and when we're deploying the disc, you can see the lobe being relatively stable, and the lobe has a tired configuration. And when you look at other views, we were generally happy with the position, even in the caudal views, and in the TE, the lobe is inside the circumflex artery. And so we released the device, no concerns about it. But the next day, this is what we saw. And so obviously, the device is not where it should be. It's posterior, and it's actually immobile. It wasn't circling around as what we would normally anticipate. So the CT again confirms that this device was dislodged and sitting in the left atrium. So here is a picture of this sitting in the left atrium. And so what we did was we just utilized the transeptal puncture from the day before. And this is initially a 13 French sheath. And you see that here I'm trying to use an end snare, which is really pointless. It really doesn't direct to the snare, direct to the device properly. Actually, before we did that, we used a pigtail to move the device a little bit, so it's actually now circulating around the left atrium. So now we then moved on to the configuration I showed you earlier, which is now I have this 25mm gooseneck snare through a 5 French GR4 guide inside a 16 French sheath. And this is an entire floor store that we saved. And so you can see me fishing around with this loop. And it is quite a fun thing to do. I mean, all you need to ensure is the patient is not under general anesthetic. This is just under sedation. And he was relatively comfortable. The procedure overall didn't take too long, but you see that eventually we would grab, you see that? So the moment you grab the end screw, you saw that I pushed the GR4 guide and closed the loop quite quickly. And then the next step is to pull this back into the sheath. And trying to do this slowly and deliberately. But you see that if you're not coaxial, unfortunately when you try and pull it in, the device comes off again. And the next thing you know is now the device is on the right side of the left atrium, and the GR4 couldn't reach very well. So we changed over to an EBU guide. This is a 5 French EBU guide, which is essentially a VOTA equivalent. And so again, the 25mm snare, and allows you to loop around. And I'm definitely in the left atrium. I'm not trying to capture the transvenous spacer wire, so don't worry about that. And it may look like the loop exits the heart, but it's just in the pulmonary veins. And here again, you see we can reach that end screw. It's a little bit of a fishing expedition overall, but you see that, second time lucky, we again grab hold of this screw. And you can see me slowly closing off the loop by pushing the EBU guide forward and closing the loop. So you can see that once we grab that, the device tries to get away, of course, and then we gradually try and pull it in. So now I change angle on the fluoroscopy, and pulling it back slowly to the arterial sheath. And what I have here is my right hand is holding onto the snare, my left hand is against the EBU guide with strong tension, and my fellow is actually holding on to the 16 French sheath, so that in unison we pull it back I pull it back, sorry. He held the sheath still, and I pull it back with some force, but you can see the whole device coming in. And then you say, well, that's just in the left atrium. What about the left ventricle? So let's show you another example. So this is a very steep chicken wing. Unfortunately, the inflection point of chicken wing is actually very proximal, is within a centimeter. And I won't go into strategies of really implanting these, but we just chose a 28 millimeter device. Our measurement was about 24.9. And unfortunately, the next day, well, it was located in the LVOT. And the patient was perfectly comfortable, not symptomatic, and obviously the echo shows that the device is lodged there against the LVOT, and you want to remove this device as soon as you can. This was actually a few years ago. And so since our center, we're used to doing tabbies, large sheaths. So this is a 14 French sheath. I didn't have a 16 French back then, but it's a 14 French sheath from the femoral artery. We did a double per close in the femoral artery and advanced this large sheath into the ascending aorta. You can see it wasn't that tough to get it up there, but because it's an 80 centimeter sheath, we weren't able to really cross it into the aortic valve. So what I did then was I used a GR4 guide, got it across the aortic valve into the left ventricle, and again used the same maneuver that I explained earlier. So using, this is, I believe, a 15 millimeter snare, and again, because we're trying to snare the end screw, we don't really need a big loop. And my intention is that, I want to snare the distal end screw, because if I were to move it vertically, you see where the hooks are is actually in parallel to aortic valve, so minimizing the damage to aortic valve. Or alternatively, I wanted to flip the device so it's horizontal, like the bottom picture, so the hooks are actually pointing away. But what ends up happening is that the device moves up in a vertical fashion, and you can see as I was trying to pull it across the LVOT, across the aortic valve, you see that the patient actually went asystolic. And so then the next step was we put a transvenous pacer and paced the patient at 80 and did the same maneuver, and the device just wiggled out of the aortic valve. So I didn't save that picture, unfortunately. I was a rookie back then. And so managed to drag the device halfway in and got it down the descending aorta. So you see what happens here now, the snare actually came off the device. And so what we end up doing was you use a bioptome. So a bioptome inside a 14 French sheath can actually open its jaw quite nicely. And so you can see here several attempts trying to bite that end screw. And it came off because the pressure wasn't firm enough. So the trick here is to actually have a very firm and strong pressure with your right hand and very deliberate and slow withdrawal maneuver back of this snare. And you can see that with that very firm and slow removal, we were able to gradually pull this device back. It takes a little bit of time. I wanted to do it slowly to make sure it doesn't release. You can see that once it came out, it wasn't an issue. This, again, retrieval took about an hour. So then in summary, to retrieve an ACP device, you want to use a 14 to 16 French sheath. Any size good neck snare is suitable, and you want to place it inside a guide to give you some directionality, and you want to grab the end screws, and preferably the distal end screw, and you really should have a bioptome available in case the device is halfway inside the sheath. And even in the left ventricle, it's possible to retrieve this device. So I know, let's just move on to Watchman. I know this figure looks very small. Of the Watchman cases that were actually retrieved, there were 6 of them. They were all in the aorta. There were no devices in the left ventricle or the left atrium that they were able to remove percutaneously. So in fact, this case was shown by Brian Wisnan and Vivek Reddy. This was Brian Wisnan's case, and they had a device that was embolized in the left ventricle. They couldn't pull it out retroaortic. They got it out across the mitral valve back in the left atrium, and then they put a 28 French cannula into the left atrium, and despite 3 snares, they couldn't pull this out. The patient went for surgery. So then I experiment, because I haven't had an embolization for a Watchman. So again, using my iPhone, we tried to use the strategy of snaring the end screw like the ACP, but what happened is that this threaded insert just really does not stick out adequately to get a very firm pressure on it. So even though I was able to grab it with the same maneuver, you see that when we try and pull it back into the 14 French sheath, the device flies off. So, so what about alternative strategies? So creating a bevel tip, you can do this. You can cut this sheath up into various configurations to really increase the diameter to try and pull back the device. And so we tried that. I got tired, so I went home. This is on my kitchen table. And we're trying to snare the body. What happens when you try to snare the body of the Watchman, it slips down to against where the hooks are. And when you try and pull this back, you see that unfortunately the hooks are an impediment to try and pull this back into the sheath. And I mean, not as if you can use your finger inside the body, but here I'm trying to facilitate, trying to pull it in, but you can see there's just no way we could do this. And then the next day I went back to the lab and I said, well, I have an 18 French expired sheath, so this is what we try. So 18 French, let's try this again by grabbing the feet. And it's actually not that easy to grab the feet. It takes a few tries, and you can see my device is really a little bit malformed. And so it's a little bit easier to drag it on the feet. But I've spoken to operators who actually retrieve the device where you grab the feet. So you try and grab a couple of the feet. And you can see when you're pulling back, again, you gotta make sure that you're really holding on very tight on your right hand, pulling that loop close. And when you do that, you see that and with it's a lot more force compared to the ACP device. And again, this is an 18 French, not a 14 French sheath, that you can pull it back, okay? So then I wanted to experiment and say, well, what other ways can you pull this device back? You know, what if you grab the body? So let's look at this. It is possible because you never know when you're fishing this device in the left ventricle what you can grab or where you can grab it. So I decided, well, let's just try multiple different ways. So here I'm grabbing, again, the body. And you can see that with some help, you can try, and again, with a lot of strength. This actually required more strength to pull back than pulling back. I knocked my camera over. I needed so much strength to pull back. But it is doable. It is doable. And then the last strategy was, well, what if I grab this device from the side? All right, so halfway, and you can collapse it and grab it from the side. And I actually didn't think that this is possible to pull it back. So I would say that, but you have to consider the tissues around you. So if this is inside the body, you consider what's the structures around you when you're doing this. And this was a lot of force to pull it back, but it is possible. So it's definitely possible to do it. But you want to consider that you're really trying to avoid embolizing a Watchman if possible. That's the bottom line. And you see the mangled device at the end of this. And you really, for retrieving a Watchman, you do need a larger device, a larger sheath. So I would recommend using a 16 to 18 French. And you want a larger snare because you might have to capture the whole device. But at the minimum, try and snare the feet. And so in summary, embolization does occur, and appears that with Watchman is slightly lower incidence compared to the ACP. But snaring the gooseneck snare is feasible for both devices, and obviously there is increasing challenges depending on where the device is embolized to. And you want to use a larger sheath for Watchman as opposed to ACP. And you want to make sure you retrieve the entire device into the sheath before you try and pull it out of the body. And you want to consider bioptome and having that available. So I just want to have a revote for question 1 and see what you would try again this time. The last time we had about 55% option A and B. So let's see what you would do this time. What is the guess? Same thing. I'm hoping for more percutaneous retrieval, but 70, no, this is now 78%. Sorry, I can't do my math. 81% versus 55%. Thank you so much.